Hi, everyone. This is your podcast, New Books in Economic and Business History. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure to be with Ran Abramitzky and Leah Boustan. Ran is professor of economics and the senior associate dean of the social sciences here at Stanford. Leah is professor of economics at Princeton University, where she also serves as the director of the industrial relations section. The two of them are the authors of a recently published book called Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. Today we're going to be talking with them about the book and about their careers. Let me say hi to them. How are you, Ran, Leah? Thanks for being here.
Hi, Javier. Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
Great. Why don't we start with knowing a bit more about your path. So, would you mind telling us where you're from? How did you end up being interested in economics and economic history? What was the path to end up writing this very interesting book on immigration?
I think let's let Ron start because he himself is an immigrant.
All right. So I grew up in Jerusalem, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. My dad, like an IT person, computer programmer in the era before computers were a big thing. And my they were both born in Israel, but my grandparents all came from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe in the late 1930s and subsequently lost all their family in the Holocaust, including parents, siblings, in my grandfather's case, including his wife and son. And then they moved to Palestine, current day Israel. From my mother's side, they moved to they founded a kibbutz, community based on egalitarian principles in the south of Israel. For my father's side, they moved to Jerusalem, and that was kind of like you could say, my early interest in income inequality and in immigration. You can trace it probably to that. My entire life was around immigration and income inequality and things like that. And I was interested in school. I liked math, I liked physics, but I also really enjoyed the social sciences and history. And I liked the rigorous of physics, but I kind of wanted more to apply it to more social uh, problems. And so I kind of fell in love with economics as an undergraduate student at the Hebrew University. And then I went on to do my PhD at Northwestern University, not actually thinking economic history is something that I really like to do, but I was fortunate to be in a program where economic history is incredibly strong. And in particular, if you ever listen to Joel Mokir, he can convince you that the fluctuations of the price of butter in the 14th century is the most fascinating things that you will ever hear about. And so he's like, his passion is contagious. And after taking his class, there was nothing I wanted to do more than economic history. And beyond that, talk with Joe and Joel, the approach of economic history to take seriously the institutional background and the context, rather than asking timeless questions, but take the particularities and context into account, resonated with me a great deal when I went to study income inequality, and later with Leah, immigration. So that's like in a nutshell.
Well, and for me, I grew up outside of Boston, went to the public high school in Lexington, Mass. And I was very lucky there to have a long tradition of policy debate at school. And my parents told me when I was a freshman in high school, you have to try the debate class because we know you and you argue about everything. This is going to fit with your interests. And of course, I argued with them and said, no, I don't want to do debate. None of my friends are doing debate. And I gave it a try, and it turned out to be um, really my lifelong passion and what led to the career that I have now. Policy debate is a very weird activity. I don't know if it happens outside of the US, but the goal in policy debate is not to make a beautiful argument with a clear and convincing speech, but it's actually to collect as much information and evidence as you can in support of your argument. And during the academic year, all of the high school policy debaters are working on the same topic. So it happened to be that my junior year of high school, we were working on the topic of should we substantially reform the immigration system in the US. And so I spent my whole junior year of high school researching different immigration policies. When I got to undergrad at Princeton, I actually chose to go to Princeton because they have a policy school here. And I thought that I was going to major in public policy, but I took an econometrics class in my sophomore year that was called applied econometrics. We were actually using real data for the first time. And I went to my professor and I said, how do I do this over the summer in Washington, helping out people working on public policy? And he said to me, well, why would you go to Washington? Why don't you just stay here and work with me? And his argument to me was, you need to learn something before you can contribute to policy. Like, you're a sophomore in college, maybe you should learn some more econometrics and learn some more data analysis. That made sense to me. So I thought I would defer going to Washington and I would learn more economics first. And of course, I haven't stopped learning economics. I've just, maybe going to Washington sometime in the future, but I guess I don't know enough yet to do that. So I'm still, doing data analysis and research based on that very serendipitous interaction that I had. And so Ron and I met soon after we both finished our PhD programs, and we've been working together ever since.
That's very interesting. One thing that I find particularly, I guess, interesting, but also inspiring about what you're saying is the role of mentors. And it seems that this path that you're describing can be perceived in the book that you wrote. So there's something that drove my attention. I was reading the book, which is that although this is a history of immigration, it's not exactly structured as a chronological story, right? It's rather an argument that it's trying to contrast and to confront what you call myths on immigration. So I'm going to ask you about what those myths are in a bit, but before that, I would like to hear if you like your own research, and you've been working on this agenda for probably a decade now. What are those priors that you had, considering that you had personal experience as an immigrant, but Leah was thinking about this since she was in high school. Then, like, what were your priors, and how does your own research has changed the way you think about this topic?
Leah, you
If
want me
you
to
mind,
start?
yeah, you can start. Ran. Sorry.
So I don't know that we had that I had very strong priors as much as it was puzzling to us how people talk very strongly about how immigration in the U.S. look like without that much supporting evidence, and so people would say that. Immigrants today are very different than immigrants in the past. In the past, those European immigrants came with nothing and then they really rose to riches very quickly, but today they aren't doing very well. We are like, oh, that's interesting. Is there evidence for that? And how today somehow immigrants are stuck in poverty and they never able to catch up or assimilate, but in the past people did so better. And so we were like, oh, that's again an interesting argument, but we don't know that we have seen evidence for that. And so we decided to subject all these myths, if you want, all these claims into rigor, more like data collection and analysis. And in the process, we learned that, in fact, there is a lot more similarity between the past and today than there are differences. And so the immigrants integrate into the economy and society today just as quickly as they did in the past, and their children rise in the same pace as they did in the past. And so a lot more similarities. I'll let Leah maybe say a few, like elaborate a bit more. But I guess to me it was like how similar the past is for today. And so um, uh, the American dream today is just as real as it was 100 years ago, rather than this idea that today things are worse than they were in the past.
Right. Can I ask you about that, Leah, as well? And would you mind then to be more extensive about what are these myths that are around in the public opinion and how exactly you're thinking about them?
Well, I think that one myth that I think I shared, if you're talking about priors, um, is that immigrants in the past who came primarily from Europe, we think of them as like the Ellis Island generation, moved up very quickly. Whereas immigrants today come from all over the world, including some very poor sending countries in Latin America or in Asia. And if they do move up, they move up more slowly. I think I had this vision in mind because if you go to high school in the US, you hear a lot about this Ellis Island generation. You see the pictures of the Statue of Liberty and the idea of give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. So this nostalgic view of immigrants making it on their own and building the country is part of the history that we learn. But I also think that the academic work was pointing in that direction too, before we were able to continue to add more data to the picture. So I remember learning some early work in labor economics, trying to study this question. And those papers didn't have all the data that you would need to answer the question. Ideally, you're able to follow people over time and say, here's how an immigrant's doing on year one after they've just arrived. Here's how they're doing on year five. Here's how they're doing on year 10. But without panel data where you're following people over time, that's very hard to do. And so, if we only have data from one time period, ultimately we're going to be comparing immigrants who recently arrived to immigrants who arrived a long time ago. And those could be very different people. In fact, it turns out that they might be Mexican farm laborers for the recent arrivals, and then German scientists for the long-term migrants. And so those are not groups that we ought to be comparing. But I had seen that work, and it seemed to fit with the nostalgic view. So I think I held that myth in my mind somewhere when we got started on the work. And what we found was that the Ellis Island generation was not doing as well as the myth would have it. So they did move up a little bit relative to their position when they first arrived in the country. But even after 20 years in the US, the degree to which that first generation moved up was pretty slow and not that different from immigration today. And in fact, a lot of the change happens with the children of immigrants. It's the second generation. And then if you think about these biases that come from thinking back over a long period of time, if you think back over a century, it's really hard in your mind to differentiate the immigrants from the kids of immigrants. It's all like a hazy, oh, this happened in the past a long time ago. Even when I think about my own grandfather, I think of him as an immigrant, but he's actually the child of immigrants. And it was my great grandfather who moved over. But when we think about immigrants today, we have a much more nuanced and detailed picture because that's what's happening in our world around us right now.
And so, regarding that, why is that the case? Why is it that you start to see mobility taking place more than anything in the second generation? Could you expand on that, Leah?
Well, I mean, first, to just sort of talk about the facts about the children of immigrants, what really struck us, I would say almost more than any of our other findings, is how similar the pattern of upward mobility is for the children of immigrants in the past and today. So think about kids who are raised pretty poor. Like, let's say they're raised at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. Children of immigrants from almost every sending country in the world today, and in the past are moving up more than children of the US born who are raised at the same point. So children of the US born might be getting to the 45th percentile, and children of immigrants might be getting to the 51st or 52nd percentile. So they're starting in the same place, but they're moving up more. So that's the basic fact that we were pretty amazed to see, especially the similarity between past and present. And when we started to look into why, which is your question, why does this happen? We found a striking pattern that much of it has to do with location choice and geography. Immigrants tend to settle in places with a lot of jobs around. And it turns out that those places were areas that offered upward mobility for their own kids and also for other kids that lived in those regions as well. So, what's special about immigrants is that, in a way, they're more footloose. They're more able to assess the different location options and choose the one that offers the most scope for upward mobility.
So there's something that I find interesting about like your answer, which is that it seems that the background of these migrants is either irrelevant or is not a fundamental piece of their success, at least at an aggregate level. Is that the case? Is it, or what other features of the immigration process are fundamental? And if you want to predict how well someone is going to do when they arrive to the US, what would be good predictors of that? Does it matter where they come from? Does it matter their education level? I don't know.
So we find, in the first generation, we find that it does. So in the first generation, how we say that we don't find this evidence of the starting at the very bottom and rising very quickly, but instead what we find for the first generation, the immigrant generation themselves, is that immigrants from some countries tended to come here and they kind of start, the earnings are below the earnings of the US born. And then they, even 30 years later, maybe they don't fully catch up and they continue to be, to lag behind. And immigrants from other countries, especially say the English speaking countries, in Germany, they come to the US, and even upon first arrival, they are doing quite well and they are even earning more than the US born. And then that stays the same way 30 years later. The striking thing, though, is that regardless of how the immigrant generation did, the second generation immigrants from, as Leah said, from nearly every sending countries are catching up with the with the children of the US born, regardless of their starting position. So, like the immigrants that are born poor, as Leah said, think about it today as you know earning like something in the order of $30,000 per year. So like two spouses who work and earn the minimum wage. The children of immigrants, of Mexican immigrants and people from El Salvador and Laos today, they are doing, they are kind of catching up and end up more likely to move to the middle class than the children of the US born. Now, of course, there are differences in terms of, so if you look at the children of people from China and India, they are doing better than the children of immigrants from Mexico. So there is a lot of heterogeneity and variation in how much better the children of immigrants do relative to the children of the US born. But the striking fact is that we don't find immigrant groups that are prone to stay behind always. We find that even immigrant groups of those groups that are accused of being not able to assimilate very well in the US, their children are doing well, and so there is no evidence of these immigrant groups that stay in poverty forever, kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. And so one of the probably other myths that subsist around the idea of immigration that you explored in the book is that immigrants are harmful in a certain way for locals, right? What are your findings around that idea? Leah, would you mind?
Sure. Well, being economic historians, we looked to answer that question in the past. And we turned to what was really the largest change in US immigration policy in history, which was the substantial restriction of the border. You could even say closing of the border in the 1920s. So there have been a number of labor economists who have looked at the question of, do immigrants harm natives in the labor market? And they often will turn to natural experiments like this. And usually it's a situation where immigrants are coming into one labor market, for example, the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. In our case, we're looking at a policy that is dramatic and nationwide. So before the border closes, there are around 1 million immigrants a year coming into the US. 1 million a year, which is really mind blowing given that the population was smaller then, and we have around 1 million immigrants a year today. And after the restriction, immigration falls to 150,000 a year. And what was useful for us in terms of getting traction on this problem is that the policy was not uniform for all immigrant groups. It was targeted to Southern and Eastern Europeans. So Italians and Poles and Russians had very small quotas after the border was restricted, whereas Brits and Germans and Irish, essentially anyone who wanted to come could come in. The quotas were not even binding for those countries. So what we did was we looked at different cities or different rural areas around the country that were more or less affected by that national policy change. And that essentially comes from the fact that for two places that have a same immigrant share in the population, some places had a lot of Italians and some had a lot of Irish. So if you had a lot of Italians in your population, you were suddenly going to have a big stop in your immigrant inflow. And then we wanted to know what happened to locals. And the bottom line is pretty crazy, but pretty similar to what other people find, which is that for local US born workers, after this immigration stop, there was no increase in occupation based income scores. So it didn't seem like the local population was gaining at all from this slowdown in immigration. So then we tried to figure out why, and it seems like there's basically a lot of ways for firms to adapt. So they could attract workers from other parts of the country. They could attract Mexicans and Canadians who are actually not restricted by this quota, or they could attract in new capital to substitute. But they didn't necessarily turn to the local population to substitute. So that piece of the book and our research comes from our own work. But then we wanted to compare past and present. And we find that our results for the 1920s is pretty similar to what people are finding for something like the Mariel boat lift in the 1980s, or for some other sources of experimental variation going forward to today. It doesn't seem like people are finding that closing the country to immigration is a benefit to locals.
And one of the things that you see is that, for example, in today's context, is that immigrants kind of come in either as very educated, and they have PhDs, also scientists, or in high tech and so on, and they contribute to innovation in this country, and they don't crowd out the US born, but rather maybe even open opportunities for the US born. They are more likely to create businesses and so on. And on the other part of the spectrum is those who come with little education, maybe even drop out of school, and they do the kind of jobs like taking care of the elderly or cleaning or uh, and the kind of jobs that many U.S. workers don't want to do for the existing wages, and whereas the U.S. U.S. Born are kind of more in the middle of these two extreme of the jobs. And so at some level this idea that the economy is a zero sum game, where if somebody is gaining, somebody else must be losing. That just doesn't seem to be the case. For example, when immigrants and the US born are not perfectly, like substitutable for one another. It's not, and again, it's not to say that there are never, there are winners and losers, for every immigration episode, and Leah and I discuss that in the book as well. For example, you do have this, you know nice paper that in the context of the Soviet Union, when mathematicians came from the former Soviet Union to the US, like the US born working in mathematics departments were less likely to publish and to get promoted, and they were crowded out by the US mathematicians. So you do have contexts in which you have some of this crowding out, but like they have to be very, but by and large we don't find evidence for this zero sum game of the economy.
So let me ask you something that goes back to something that Leah mentioned at the beginning when she was acknowledging a certain prior that had was in line with this myths. But and my question here is, why do you think that these myths are so persistent? I guess. Of course, it seems that there was a lack of evidence, and there was even some research that was supporting some of them. Um, but probably there are additional things, and I would like to hear what's your opinion on that. I don't know if you would like to say something about that, Ren.
Well, it's a good question, Javier. There are a number of reasons. One that come to mind is it's a it's a topic that generates a lot of emotion, and everybody has like a personal. You see, I just told you about my family history, and Leah told you about her family history, and it's the kind of topics that tend to get very personal. You hear a story of a family member, and then it gets to you at an emotional level, and you start to think, well, that must be the experience of everyone. Or you get to see, and by the way, it goes both sides. It's not necessarily just negative stories about immigrants. You also see, oh, look at all this high tech, look at Google and eBay. All of those were created by immigrants, so the immigrants must be terrific. And so, but Leah and I kind of point out in the book that when you have 30 million immigrants coming, there will be somebody who is a mass murderer and somebody who is changing the path of us forever. But what about the typical immigrant experience? Those are the ones of a life quietly lived, of the teacher, next door teacher, who has just a simple and nice life, and struggles and challenges, and we wanted to tell the stories of those immigrants, not just the outliers, but the average immigrants. And for those, the our data was helpful in the sense that our data at the end of the day, for example, the census data that we use, at the end of the day, it's just a collection of hundreds of thousands of stories. You see the person and you see their family in the census records, and you see where they lived, and how they named their children, and who they married, and what are they do for a living, and how much they earn. And at the end, by linking them over time and by looking at many thousands of them, you get the more typical story of an average immigrant, rather than the ones who stick, that are outliers.
I also think there's a lot of conflict these days about how to interpret American history. More than I've ever remembered, this question has come up as a dividing line between the left and the right. And one piece of American history that it seems like everyone can agree upon is that immigrants from Ellis Island 100 years ago are good. They moved up the economic ladder quickly, they moved into the middle class, they tried to become Americans and culturally assimilate. And so you can hear politicians and pundits as different as former President Barack Obama and commentator Rush Limbaugh, who you would never see in the same, ideas space together, saying very positive things about immigrants in the past. And where the differences come in is on how people think about immigrants today. Are they similar to the Ellis Island generation, or are they very different? And so I think we're kind of holding fast to this myth of the Ellis Island generation because it's one of a very vanishingly small number of things that it seems like we can all agree upon as a country. And so now Ron and I are here to, in a way, burst that myth and say, well, the Ellis Island generation was not as special as you thought it was. They didn't move up particularly quickly. They're not that different from immigrants today. And so it seems like it's this one kind of piece of American history that people have kept apart and kept special because it's something that we can agree upon.
And then to follow up on what Leah just said is that part of it is because those immigrants, the Ellis Island generation, 100 and something years have passed. And so we look at this from this long-term perspective of how the Norwegians who came 150 years ago are doing in the US today. And the story looks quite great. Whereas when you look at the immigrants from Mexico or that just arrived 10 years ago, clearly this is not comparing apples to apples, looking at the Norwegians who arrived 150 years ago with the Mexican who arrived today. And so one of the, I guess, messages of our book is that you should think about immigration and immigration policy in generations, not in years. And when you do that and you look at the children of immigrants and you learn all the lessons from that past wave of mass migration, how it eventually ended up doing, then you kind of get a more positive, happy picture for immigrants than if you look at them when they are first generation struggling and so on.
So now that you described your book as this essential contribution to what you could think as the soul of the U.S., right, which is like migration, at least an important part of that. Um, how special do you think that the American case is? And I'm here asking you to speculate a bit, but I also know that you've been working on other episodes of similar types of immigration. How much your results are American story, or how much of that could potentially be insightful for other historical episodes?
So, in order to engage in the same kind of data collection effort that we've done, you need to be able to follow people over time throughout their career and also follow parents to their children. So, that's been a relatively recent breakthrough for economics research in the US and around the world. So, there have been other research teams who've been looking into similar questions in Canada and Australia, so other kind of settler economies, but also in Europe, in France, Germany, the UK, in the Netherlands, and Sweden. And that would be for more recent immigration episodes. And so we're only just starting to see the results roll in. Some of those papers have been published, some of them are working papers. So, statements that I'll make about that literature are definitely subject to revision, but it seems like people are finding pretty similar patterns of upward mobility in the settler economies like Canada and Australia. And at least for Western Europe, it seems like there's less upward mobility for immigrants in France and in the UK, for example, today. So there's a nice paper on that comparative case in the Economic Journal. So I've started to think and speculate about, what is it about American society that seems to be so effective at integrating immigrants, especially because there aren't a lot of government programs to integrate immigrants. So if you look at the European case, it seems like they have more programs to learn the language, to help you find work, and to maybe resettle immigrants to certain locations. They're taking more active steps, yet it doesn't seem like they're as effective as the United States and Canada. So, to start to think about what are the kind of ingredients in the special sauce, something I'm interested in for the future.
And to add a note to what Leah said, uh, from historical perspective, Europe for many, for all this time period we were talking about in this Ellis Island generation, Europe was mostly sending country rather than a receiving country for many years. And so, most of the immigrants who came to the United States were from Europe during this Ellis Island generation. And Europe became a receiving country of immigrants only in the last few decades. And so the work that you will have there will be mostly on the modern period today in terms of like how immigrants do in Europe. And in the past, it will be mostly about how they were doing when they were sending immigrants. And when you do that, for example, Santiago Perez has done some work on this age of mass migration in the past for Argentina. And for example, he's looking at Italian immigrants. Some came to the U.S. and some came to Argentina. And at that context, he finds that the U.S. was not that special in the sense that Italian immigrants to Argentina did just as well. In fact, they were doing even perhaps better than the Italian immigrants to the U.S. But this is kind of where you see this a bit disjoint in the sense that Europe was mostly a sending country becoming a receiving country. So that's why in the Europe context you see less of the this long path, long-term historical research.
Let me push a bit down the conversation in that direction and get a bit meta here. Nadad, you mentioned Santiago's work ran, and this question on that you can call external validity, I guess, seems like particularly important in economic history, right? So most of us who are interested in history are people that appreciate context, and I guess that the efforts to reach strong causal claims could be at odds at some point with like that, right? So I guess my question for you is, how do you think about this in terms of the knowledge generation of the discipline? How are we as economic historians accumulating knowledge and understanding better the world between this tension of having very robust results in a very specific historical context and the intentions of knowing like larger lessons from history? And here I guess I'm asking you to tell me, how do you talk about this with your students, with people with whom you, or well, not the people, but when you're refereeing papers, how do you think about this? And I would like to hear the two of you on this. Maybe Leah, you want to start.
Sure. I think that as economic historians, we need to tackle the big changes in history that create the world that we live in today. So we want to understand that there were time periods where women were not in the labor force to the same degree that they are now. And we now see the trends over time and how that's changed. We want to understand that it doesn't go without saying that the US population is 14% foreign born. That's actually been the immigration level during the age of mass migration from Europe up to 1920, but then the immigration level plummeted and so only 4% of the population was foreign born as of 1970. So the world that we see today, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was created by many of these long run processes. And so I think as economic historians, we have to tackle the big trends. Whereas when I'm advising labor economists, I think, well, yes, you can study a small policy in a particular location and really nail down what we think the causal relationships are there and what some of the mechanisms might be, because there's a greater chance for rolling out that program, for example, to other locations and scaling it up and maybe generating some external validity to other similar programs today. But as economic historians, I think our task is a bit different. I think it's understanding the big trends that generate the world that we see here. So I remember when I first met Ron, and we were walking in Huntington Gardens, which is a story that we tell in the book. He was telling me about his work on the kibbutz and who chooses to leave the kibbutz, which is an equal sharing society, to move to a market economy right next door. And I said, well, that's fascinating as a theory that we could then apply to some of the biggest population movements in world history, too. We can move beyond the case study of the kibbutz to try to understand global migration trends, and maybe who moves from Europe to the US during this period when 35 million people are moving. So I keep pushing myself and pushing my students to try to look at broader trends, so that we can make sense of the world that we live in today.
And let me add just another. Of course, I agree with everything Leah said, but just to say that at the end of the day, as economic historians, you ought to care about this whatever you study in its own right. So, being an economic historian means that if I study the kibbutz, or if I study immigration in the United States today, or if Leah studies the, like blacks moving to white neighborhoods, she gotta care about the answer to the question in the historical context that she studies in itself. And that means to not superimpose the thinking that we have today about how people must have felt like 50 years ago when things happened, but rather to bother and learn from the perspective of people who lived at the time, the historians, qualitative evidence, the data, how the data was collected, to care deeply about how it's interesting in its own right. In this sense, it's I guess my view is that every estimate that we generate in economics is a local estimate. If you study, changes in policies in the United States today, then you generate an estimate that is relevant to the United States between the years 2000 and 2015, and it might not have a huge external validity for China. And so we have to kind of care, first of all, for what we study in itself. And I think that's in the DNA of economic historian. But then, as Leah said, once you do that and you are comfortable that you generated the like knowledge that is valuable in the context in which it studies, we can start to think about how, really, just like Leah described, how many current problems have historical origins. We didn't just get here today by chance, but it has historical roots, and history can often serve as either a natural experiment, or as intellectual look at a world that doesn't exist today. So, for example, one of our first papers was, well, how would immigration look like in a world without immigration restrictions, when everybody who want to move can move? Well, why don't we look at this Ellis Islander who didn't need a visa or a passport to get into the US, and see like who chooses to move to the US, rather than mush between the choices of people and the immigration policy and so on. So kind of gives you a window to a world that even doesn't exist today, but it's expand your intellectual horizon, if you want, of exploring alternative possibilities of how the world could have been.
That's fascinating. Let me ask you one final question, because our time is almost over. And I ask this to all my guests: why writing a book, right? Why the discipline that rewards, in general, much more articles, for instance, is why in that context it is important to write a book. Yeah.
Well, first I'd ask, why write an article? Like, what are your goals in your intellectual endeavors? Something you should ask for each piece. And when you think about writing a new article, you have to ask the same. Do I have new data to collect that I want to then describe and share? Do I have a a new a new finding that I want to probe and see how robust it is, and document that? If that's the project that you're working on now, then probably it's time to write an article. But when Ron and I got to this point in our research where we had written a number of articles on the age of mass migration, we really wanted to step back and see what does our work say about where the US has been and where it's going in terms of immigration policy. And we think that our findings, when put together, have a lot of insight to share about where we're going next. So at the end of the book, we do talk about some of, you might say, policy implications, but it's not that there's particular policies we say pass this, don't pass that, but more a vision for what immigration policy should be based on, for some of the facts that should be the basis of making these decisions, and some of the values and the directions that come out of analyzing those facts.
It's you imply, and you're probably right, that the incentives in the profession are currently, mostly to write papers and not to write books. And maybe when you talk to a young person, you would not recommend them to write a book, before they get tenure. There is a lot of the publishing papers is important, and the publication process is long, and so on. But I guess that there are two, like Leah said, there are first, I see two reasons, I guess, to write books. One is a broader audience. So for Leah and I, it was important to reach out beyond talking to other economists, and in this case, beyond even talking to other sociologists and historians. We thought that the questions that we were asking are of broad interest to the general public, and we wanted to be able to communicate with them. And when you write to the general audience, it kind of keeps you honest at some level, because it forces you to not hide behind your jargon of the field. That is a group of people that agreed to not question certain things and certain assumptions, and to communicate this to the broader world. And when you do that, you also find, oh, my book cannot be complete unless we think about some other things, because you can write a paper about the effect of X on Y, and if you're asked a question about something else that affect Y, you are like, oh, that's not related to the hypothesis that I'm asking, because it's orthogonal to X. But you're like, well, but you can't really write a book like that. The book is about Y. So you have to consider all these things that affect Y. And so it forces you to think more broadly about the outcomes and the phenomena that you are talking, and eventually produce something that is like more bigger than just a paper, and that makes one single point and elaborate on an argument. And so that is the way. And again, it's not every idea lends itself to a book. And Leah and I, took us 10 years before we decided, well, we think that the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts, and now we should write a book. We first wanted to understand smaller, simpler questions that lended themselves to articles. But broader audience and elaborate argument is something you can't really do in a paper, but the book, you can lends itself more to that.
Well, I'm very glad that you decided to write this book. This is a fascinating book. I had a great time reading it. I really recommend it to all the people that are listening to it. I would like to close with one of the praises that have been made to the book. This one is by Angus Deaton. I think it summarizes pretty well the contribution of the book. Deaton says, while Americans are intensely polarized about immigration, facts and history can help change minds. And Streets of Gold has the facts, millions and millions of them, about the amazing and often surprising history of American immigration. It is a splendid testament to the power of big data to illuminate our past and what it means for the future. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
so
Javier.
much.